All right, in this video, you are going to be learning the difference between independent and dependent variables. So an independent variable, this is defined as the variable that is changed or controlled in a scientific experiment. A dependent variable is what you measure. It's something that's affected during the experiment. So let's practice. All right, a scientist wants to see if the brightness of light, so maybe he's changing the brightness of the light bulbs, has any effect on a moth being attracted to the light. So does the moth come close to the light? Does it back away from the light? Does it touch the light? Does it get within a few centimeters, a few feet? So in this scenario, in this little experiment, if the scientist did it, the brightness of the light is controlled. He's controlling or changing the brightness of the light. He can make it very dim, very bright, in the middle. The scientist is controlling the light. So that would be the independent variable. I always think that an independent variable is something that you change. An independent woman can change her mind 1,000 times. So an independent variable is something that a scientist is changing. Now, how the moth reacts to the different light levels, so maybe the distance to the light source, how close the moth travels towards the light bulb, that would be the dependent variable because that's something that you can measure. So a dependent variable is always something that you can measure. All right, we're going to go through 9 practice problems. So in these problems, we're going to be circling the independent variable and underlining the dependent variable. All right, number 1, a study was done to find if different tire treads affect the braking distance of a car. All right, so independent variable, something that we are changing. For all of these scenarios, I would pause the video and then think for yourself, then listen to the explanation. So what we're changing is the different tire treads. That would be the independent variable. You can change the tire treads on every car that you ever drive. That's the independent variable. What you're measuring is the braking distance. So how long does it take the car to stop? Is it 10 meters? Is it a mile? Is it 3 feet? What's the braking distance? That's something that you can measure. That's the dependent variable. Number 2, the time it takes to run a mile depends on the person's running speed. All right, so in this setup of the word problem, it actually tells you that the dependent variable is the time because the time is depending on the speed. So the dependent variable or something that you can measure is the time that it takes. You can time someone running a mile. What you change is your independent variable. So the time it takes is your dependent variable. That's what you're measuring. You are measuring the time. But you can change the running speed, how fast or how slow that you run. That's your independent variable. Number 3, the height of bean plants depends on the amount of water they receive. So the independent variable, something that you change. You can't change the height of a bean plant. I guess you can if you cut it down. But you can change the amount of water. So the amount of water that you give the plant is the independent variable. Now, it'd be more likely to measure the height of the bean plant. So the height would be something that you would be measuring. That's your dependent variable. Number 4, the higher the temperature of the air in the oven, the faster a cake will bake. All right, independent variable. What are you changing? Well, you're changing the temperature. You're changing the temperature that the oven is set at. And then, what are you measuring? Well, how fast a cake will bake. Essentially, you could time it. That's something that you can measure. That's a dependent variable. Number 5, lemon trees receiving the most water produce the most lemons. So what are we changing? Well, you're changing the amount of water. Those that get the most water apparently make the most lemons. So what are you measuring? Well, you're measuring the lemons produced. So maybe you're counting the number of the lemons that were produced by each tree. But that's something that you can measure or count. Dependent variable. Number 6, an investigation found that more bushels of potatoes were produced when the soil was fertilized more. All right, what are you changing? Well, you're changing the amount of fertilizer that you're putting in the soil. So you can change the amount of fertilizer. What are you measuring? Well, you're measuring how many bushels of potatoes were actually produced. So you can count the bushels of potatoes that were produced in each section of soil that you change the amount of fertilizer. Number 7, students measured the temperature of the water at different depths in Lake Skywalker and found that the temperature varied. All right, so what are you changing? Well, you're changing the depth in the lake. You're changing how deep that you're traveling with that thermometer to measure the temperature of the water. So again, you're measuring the temperature of the water. So you take your thermometer, go to different depths, and you are measuring the temperature of the water. So temperature is going to be dependent, the depth is going to be independent. Number 8, the amount of pollution produced by cars was measured for cars using gasoline containing different amounts of lead. All right, so what are you changing? Well, you're changing the amounts of lead inside that gasoline. You have different amounts of lead. That's changing. Independent variable. What are you measuring? Well, you're measuring the amount of pollution. In some way, shape, or form, you're measuring the amount of pollution, so that's going to be your dependent variable. All right, and last one. 4 groups of rats are first masked and then fed identical diets except for the amount of vitamin A they receive. Each group gets a different amount. After 3 weeks on the diet, the rats' masses are measured again to see if there has been a decrease in their mass. All right, so what are you changing? Well, in this scenario, it says that what you're changing is the amount of vitamin A. Each group got a different amount of vitamin A. So that's your independent variable. Now, what are you measuring? Well, it says you put the rats on a scale and you get their mass. So their masses is the dependent variable. All right, if you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment.